Hey, so this is the second part of the puberty discussion that Jess and I were having. Like we mentioned, the first one, we wanted to make sure that we could have a more complete, well-rounded discussion on this topic. This is part two of the puberty discussion that we had. It's the final portion of it, so hope you enjoy. Let us know if you have any questions or comments by sending us an email afterwards or sending us a DM on Instagram.
Welcome to Robot Unicorn. We are so glad that you are here. As always, let's start the show with a question from Scott.
Okay, I think we're going to switch topics a little bit here. I think you have sort of touched on this a bit, but there's a bit more nuance in the social media side of things, because I think, particularly for older kids, social media has dramatically changed, honestly, the way children learn about their bodies and their development. Mm-hmm. And I guess I'm wondering, how do you see this like digital landscape? Because it's so much different from even when we were kids, right? Learning about these things, or not learning, I guess. How do you think it's reshaped or maybe complicated the conversations that parents need to have with their kids about puberty and sex?
Yeah, I think it's kind of what I was saying before, right? Where, okay, maybe it would have been okay to wait until your kids are like 11 to have those conversations back when we were kids, because, well, honestly, even then, the majority of people, like men that I've been talking with lately about this are like, oh yeah, no, I was exposed to porn far before my parents ever talked to me about it.
Yeah, 100%.
So I think even then it just maybe was not as reported. But the more guys I talk to, like everyone has a story. Like, oh, it's at my cousin's house, or it's at my friend's house, or I saw this here.
Or on the playground even.
Yeah, someone was telling me the other day, oh, I saw it on the playground at school on like a PSP. So I think now we have more information. We know that our children are likely going to be exposed. So let's have these conversations a little bit earlier. Again, that doesn't mean you have to go into the full sex talk super early. But I would still be having the sex talk around ages 9. Yeah, like around there.
Because you don't think they're exposed earlier than that?
Yeah, I mean, like to me, that's like by 9, I would have had that talk. But I would still be having, like, for me, from my comfort level with our own child, they'll be having it around age 8.
Yeah. Right.
Because I even know for our own daughter, there's people with tablets on the bus, right? I heard recently about a little boy who saw pornography at school on a school tablet because somehow someone had found a workaround and just found it there, and they were 8 years old.
Yeah. Oh, I guarantee you kids will be able to find ways around firewalls, and yeah, it is definitely something that they're much more intelligent than we give them credit for.
Yeah, I think most places, like I was looking this up the other day, are suggesting that talk happens between 8 to 10. Okay. But I'm saying 9 because just of what I'm seeing and what we're hearing about in our practice. Yep. And but yeah, again, that's up to you. You know your child, you know what they're going to be exposed, like you know where they are. But
so I think that's one part of it, though, like the idea of sex talk.
Yep.
And what we see online. But I think in particular social media.
Yes.
I don't know. Like it's hard for me to know, but I'm just thinking in terms of our girls. Mm-hmm. There will likely be unrealistic developmental expectations for their body and like the way things look.
I see what you're saying.
Right? Like they're going to compare their body to others. I think that is around that age too. And I feel like in general, social media, you often see the best of everything, sure. Right? So you're not seeing, I don't know, like if I were to put a picture online of myself, I'd probably suck in my gut a little bit and flex. And
of course, you're always seeing the best version of yourselves, right? Unless you're on my Instagram stories and seeing my face. It's intentionally why I don't filter myself. But anyway.
So I think that unrealistic expectation about even the way their body develops during puberty too.
Yes. And to that, I'd say keep your kids off social media as long as you possibly can. especially during puberty, like of a time of such fragility. Like we haven't even talked about the emotional changes that happen during puberty.
Like it happens for many years, right? Like,
Yeah. But I like 16, 17, like if you can
yeah.
keep them off of it, because it's not, and I know again, this is like an ideal world, but you're the parent, you're in charge. Like you can create that ideal world. Your kids might be mad at you. I know that's what we'll be doing, because
100%.
your child does not need to be exposed to the best version of all these other people.
Yeah, you definitely get into the comparison game from an early age. And I feel like that would be hard to, like, to almost be baked into your brain. Like your neurons would develop to start comparing yourself to everyone.
Yeah.
And it would be hard to get out of that.
It's already hard enough for a young boy or a young girl to look at their peers in class and compare themselves to what they're wearing, what they look like, all of that. Like comparison will happen because your child is surrounded by other kids their age all the time. So to add to that and then look at the best version, and often what I'm hearing in teenage girls that we're supporting in our practice is like they're looking at 25-year-olds, on TikTok.
It's pretty hard to know age too, right? What you're looking at.
So you're comparing yourself to a full-grown woman at 13 and like looking up to that and the dances and the like. Yeah. So I don't know. That's like a pretty bold suggestion, but my suggestion would be just keep them off of it, especially during such a vulnerable and important time of their life that they don't need that. And if they are on it, it's highly supervised.
Yeah.
That goes back to our screen time episode, and we can do a future episode specifically on social media, because I feel like that's just a whole other can of worms that we could get into.
I know a social media company has reached out to talk to us about their child protection measures, but honestly, my thought on any of that is if social media companies gave a shit, they would just not allow anyone under the age of 16.
Yep.
If they cared, but what they want is consumers on their products. That's really what it is. So it's up to the parents to
and
make that happen.
We didn't really grow up. Like I think we had like MSN Messenger. But I would say
AOL
Messenger. And like maybe MySpace was around. I wasn't on it. But like in that time of our lives, we didn't really have that so much. Mm-hmm. But I would say you
didn't have MySpace?
No, I didn't have MySpace.
Really? I did.
Oh, good for you.
I didn't know how to use it, but
but you had it.
Yeah, I had it.
So we were lucky in that way. Like it was just starting. Now the generation after us, they struggled. Like if I talk to anyone kind of in that age group, like 20 to like 27 or something like that, they will tell me how detrimental it was to their mental health to have social media at that age, right? So it's not like we don't know how it impacts someone. And the majority of people I talk to in that age group, no one's like, oh, I wish my parents would have let me have more social media, right? Like that age group, the people that I'm talking to are like, it was so bad. So many people in our class were struggling. Everyone was comparing themselves to each other. And so I think we can hear from those stories and learn from that. And to parents of kids in that generation, like how would you know? Like it was all brand new. Like social media is not that old. Like it's quite
was
new.
Facebook like truly long? It was like 2008 or something, wasn't it?
Yeah. Like something like really quite recent. So now our generation knows. So we can do things different for our kid, right? And I'm hoping that we'll see a wave of more protection for children. I think it will take a while. I don't think it'll be fully done with our generation of parents. I think it'll probably be the next one. People always ask me, like, what do you think your kids will do differently? Like our child's generation will do differently than our generation and the previous ones. I think it'll have a lot to do with like screens and social media and stuff like that.
Honestly, I was seeing, which generation was it? I think the one after us. What is it after us? We're millennials and then...
Gen Z?
Is that what it is? I don't know. Anyways, apparently the generation after us is even drinking far less alcohol.
Yeah. I think
like they're healthier people. Yeah.
I think we'll see a lot of that. Like, because people will be like, what do you think the reparenting, that our kids will have to do? I think it'll be a lot about social media, like posting pictures and stuff of kids online, Like they'll probably not do that. I think that they'll give social media to their kids like way later. I think we're kind of in like that bridging generation right now. I don't know. That's just my take, but
Possibly. Okay, so
separate
let's just assume that someone listening, their child, is currently on social media and they're seeing these pictures of maybe 25-year-old women and they're a girl and they're looking at that, or for boys, they're looking at someone who's older than them as well. How do you think a parent should have that discussion if their child is already on social media?
I think, again, calm, quiet moments. So just remember that those are the best times to have discussions, not heat of the moment.
Yeah.
Talking about your child, about what are they seeing online, very shame-free, right? Know that if your child has access to a device, they're going to search for that kind of stuff. They're curious. And I always say to parents, like, if you found out that your child was like searching porn or searching naked pictures or looking at 25-year-olds dancing on TikTok, don't get them in trouble, because that is what they're wired to do. They're wired to be curious, and they have this machine. It's like a kid in a candy store that allows them to be so curious. And it's only natural that that's what they're going to do. So if you shame them for it and you get mad at them for it, they're not going to come to you with what they've seen, and it's going to create this rupture. So as always, be very curious with them. What did you see? How did it make you feel? Okay, I think we should have a discussion about social media. And here's how I'm feeling, and here's why. And see how your child responds. They're probably going to be pissed off at you. Like if they've had social media or untethered access to the internet and you're taking that away from them, they're probably going to be mad.
Yeah, I would be.
Yeah, I would be too. I'm sure. My parents, again, something that they did very well, they had a lot of structure around our TV time and everything like that. TV time, screens, family computer. So you can make some small changes and let your child be pissed off with you about it. But stay in communication with them. But it's actually okay sometimes if your child's mad. And I think this is one of those scenarios where that's okay.
I think the way I would handle it, let's say with our girls, let's just say they're 12. They have access to social media. We've already given it to them, which will not happen. But
in the off chance.
In the off chance that we do that, I think the main thing that I would discuss with them is that what you are seeing, likely the majority of the time, is pictures that are not real. They have filters added to them, especially with AI now.
I think whether or not they're on social, that's a really good idea.
Yeah. Like what they're seeing is not real life. And I think we as parents, as adults, can sometimes get in that trap of seeing pictures or videos posted online and think that that's real, that person actually did those things and it's as picturesque as what they're showing. When the actual reality is they're showing only the very, very best. Because we were even talking about, I'm creating a photo album from last year right now. And I selected the best like the photos that I liked the best. And I think I still had 1,400 photos that I have to choose from and pare down to like
however many
100 photos for our photo album. So of that whole year, I chose only a portion of, like a small portion of all the photos and videos that we took.
Yeah.
And it was still 1,400 photos. So just imagine that's what people are doing online. They're taking the thousands of photos they've taken. They're paring it down to the 10.
I think
you're seeing perfection basically online, and that's not real.
I think something that helped me a lot as a kid, because even before social media, I mean, I remember there'd be things like standing in front of La Senza and like looking at the girls and be like, why don't my boobs look like that? You know, like things like that. Yeah. Very normal. So in some class or something, they showed a video of things being airbrushed. Like a picture of just like a normal woman and how it was like airbrushed. And I think that helped me understand, even at an early age.
What do you mean, like in Photoshop?
Yeah, like Photoshopped, that a lot of these images I would see in magazines and in the mall and wherever. Like their images are everywhere, whether you're not on social media or not, your child's still going to see it. I think that video specifically, I can remember watching it, helped me understand that I'm not always seeing reality. So having those conversations with your kids, especially as they're going through puberty, I think will be really important.
Yeah, because it's such a, like, it's a time of so much bodily development.
Oh, yeah.
So I can imagine, I remember it being very confusing, right? And now we have so much more imagery content coming at us, like we did at that time too. But we have even more now, especially with social media and YouTube and whatever, all these different things that we're getting bombarded with. So it's, I think that discussion of what is real, the philosophical question of what is real.
And like, again, to be a broken record on every single podcast episode, the best thing that we can do is nurture the relationship we have with our child, especially during this time of life, right? Because,
well, I think you could say every time of
yeah,
life,
but
because it helps at that time of life
during
too,
this
right?
time of life, and we'll get into this in a different episode we're going to record, your children will have this desire to go towards their peers, right? That's a natural desire that happens around the puberty age. They start to become more socially oriented. They want to hang out with their peers. The peers become fun. That becomes like the big thing in their life. And parents, unless we're intentional, can kind of be left to the side. And if we're left to the side and we let our children just hang out with friends all the time and do things with their peers and kind of focus on that, we can be lost as the source of wisdom, and they can start turning to their peers. And so I think, yes, in every season of life, obviously parents are the most important to our kids and we want to be that figure to them. But especially you're going to have to be intentional during puberty, because their desire, their natural innate desire is going to be to turn towards their peers. It's good and important. They should have friendships. And if you just let that happen and you're not consistently tuning in with them, having those bedtime conversations, going for a long drive and making sure you're intentional about your conversation, the peers might become the trusted advisors. And I think we want to, there's wisdom in remaining our child's trusted advisor, especially as they enter into puberty and the teen years.
So sorry, you're saying that they have like a desire to turn toward friendships and peers around puberty?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's like one of the stages of development that is important. Like they start to seek friends.
But that's linked with puberty specifically?
I mean, it happens at that same age, yeah. So
okay.
I would say yes. And I would say that's like so common across the board. Like we see them turn towards wanting to be accepted and peers. And if they don't have that solid rock, that solid foundation to come back to that relationship with you, that seeking acceptance and the desire to be with peers will change their personality, because they'll be like, oh, well, if I do this, then I'm accepted. If I look this way, then I'm accepted. And they're trying to figure themselves out. It's an age of a lot of confusion. So they need that solid rock to come back to so that they can be reminded of who they are and know that they're always loved no matter what. And know that you are the wise advisor that they can turn to. But if they don't know that, they will go to their peers and they'll get information elsewhere. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I really want to emphasize that, especially during puberty.
There seems to be kind of a big focus on like the puberty talk or the sex talk, mm-hmm. whatever. But you've been mentioning that it's an ongoing discussion, and that's important because especially as they get closer to that age of puberty, they will turn to their peers. Mm-hmm. But can you walk us through what this actually looks like? So both with your clients and in our family, and how parents can recognize the natural moments to build in these conversations and be that trusted advisor for their children. So I realize it's not just about showing that you're the smartest on this topic. It's about always being there for them. But then how do you build in these natural moments to have the conversations about puberty?
I see what you're saying.
So I know you say right now, at least at this age, our oldest loves to have conversations in the car mm-hmm. and at bedtime. Mm-hmm. Maybe that will always be the case, but I sort of doubt as she gets older, that will be what she wants to do. She may want to read instead in bed. And
So I think this idea of the little, like the tiny moments where you can have these conversations, like even if you're just thinking, like you're just on your phone scrolling, right? And your child's like, oh, what are you looking at? And you're like, oh, I'm looking at the news or something like that. And then that's a great opportunity to have a bigger conversation. Like, hey, there's like tons of stuff that you can see on a phone. Like how many different things do you think you can search up on a phone? You know, and then they might say a couple things like, yeah, there's so many like cool things that you can look up on a phone. Like you can read the news. Not that that's cool, but like you can read the news. You can look up how to 3D print something. You can look up all these things. But there is some things that you can see on a phone that are unsafe. Like, have you ever heard of things that are unsafe? And then have the conversation, right? That's like a natural small moment where you can have a conversation. It's not like they're asking you the question, but you're sitting side by side looking at something on your phone and you can kind of segue into that. And maybe it's 5 minutes.
see, that doesn't sound all that natural to me. That's not, I don't know, sitting there next to our daughter, our oldest, scrolling on my phone. That's not the natural, that takes a lot of forethought. I don't think it's just you're sitting there on your phone scrolling, your daughter comes up to you or your child comes up to you and you're like, did you know you can look up bad things on your phone? What bad things do you think there are on? Like, I don't know.
So to me, maybe that's like, because
Yeah.
I'm always thinking about it, I'm like, oh, perfect. This is a great
I think
opportunity to
for you-
segue into this.
I think for you that is the case.
Yeah.
But I don't know that that's the case for most parents.
Right. So maybe if you know you want to have these conversations, kind of have it in the back of your mind that maybe you're waiting for an opportunity where you could segue that in. Right. So if you're like, okay, I haven't had the unsafe pictures discussion. I know I want to segue that in at some point. And maybe you're like waiting for an opportunity to have that. Or even like the bra conversation, right? In the puberty toolkit, we talk about like finding your first bra. So maybe your child is like folding laundry with you sometime and, oh, like you're folding a bra. Oh, let's talk about that, you know?
Do you have to fold a bra?
I mean, you can, yeah.
Okay.
Things Scott needs to learn. I mean, not really. Sometimes you can like stack them too. I don't know. Mine are too old to know what to do with, but but you can have a bra in the laundry, right? And like talk about that. And like, oh, you know, tell them stories of when you were a kid. I remember the first time that I started growing boobs. Like, man, that was kind of different and unexpected. I wonder how you'll feel when that happens to you. Like, then all of a sudden you're having that discussion, right? Or, like just finding the little moments where maybe that can come. I think in terms of the sex talk, I do think we could do a whole other episode just on that. A lot of the teachings that are suggested for kids is to talk about reproduction in nature and animals and stuff like that first, to kind of open up the discussion that reproduction and sex is a very natural, normal thing that happens like all throughout the world and all throughout nature and animals. And I think that can be helpful for kids too, to know that like it's not just adults and
Yeah.
grown-ups that do it. It's all over nature. So, I mean, you could be driving past a farm and maybe have a discussion. I don't know.
You witness something
You witness something.
at the
and
local farm.
we live in a rural area, so
Yeah.
there's lots of farms. So farms are like,
Hey, maybe.
it's a little easier to have that discussion where we live. That's why
I
I
don't
made
know.
the joke.
That
But,
might be scarring, but
you know, you're watching Discovery Channel.
Discovery Channel. Are they going to show that on there?
These
don't
are
know.
not actual suggestions. I'm just being a butt right now. But that can be a way. Like when you're describing it, right? Just to ease it a little bit. It's like this is actually very natural. It happens all over the world. Anyway, finding the tiny moments, and sometimes they won't be there. And sometimes you just have to have that conversation at bedtime in the car, you know.
Yeah.
But if you can, I know I'm, like you said, I'm very good at doing that. I'm very good at like finding these little opportunities. And,
Yeah, you are.
And like, oh, they were at their cousin's house and their cousin was watching YouTube, right? So then on the way home, we're driving and I'm like, hey, did you know, like sometimes you can see things on YouTube that don't make you feel very good, and right? And then you have that conversation. So,
Yes.
but if folks want more on that, we can do another podcast episode on that.
Sure. Okay. I think this is my final question for today. So
boy.
then you can be rid of me after this. As a therapist, and even being my wife, you have worked with plenty of people who feel like they're giving from an empty well. So let's say with our children, I'm their father. I'm a father of 3 daughters. I've never experienced any of what they're going to be going through. I didn't even learn about it. So you talk about pads, and what was the one mind-blowing thing? There's like a special bin or whatever in a women's washroom by the toilet or something like that you can put like pads and tampons in.
Yep.
Yeah, so that's something I will literally, there's no way for me to know that information. So I feel like I'm in a position, and I have a feeling a lot of parents, honestly, even if we had a boy, I don't know that I would know what to even discuss or teach them. So it feels like I am giving from an empty well. I have nothing to actually give because there's nothing there.
Yeah.
And I'm sure mothers of sons would feel the same way potentially.
Yeah.
So how do you guide parents through educating their children about puberty and the experiences they're going to have when, like, I've never personally navigated through having a period, or I don't know that there's these little bins beside the toilet in a women's washroom. How can I make them even feel comfortable to come to me to have any of these discussions when they're likely going to know Dad knows nothing about this?
Question back to you. Historically, if there's been something you haven't known that you need to know or you need to learn, how have you gone about learning about that thing?
Well, I mean, you know how I do that. I am one to be like, I don't know the answer to this question right now. Let's look it up right now, or let's have a discussion. I have to look this up and understand it better before I have the conversation with you.
Yeah.
I think it's a 2-part question for me, because first they have to be comfortable enough to even ask me, right? Like, what if you're gone and one of our girls has a burning question about something related to puberty, but they don't even feel comfortable enough to come to me, right? Like, they know you are the expert on that, and they would feel more comfortable.
Yeah.
And
which I could see.
And I think that makes sense. Or they might just be so uncomfortable with even asking about it in general that they won't come to maybe either of us.
So I have a few things that can help you with this. First, I do think that there is an ownership on us as parents to try and learn it. I think historically it's been enough to be like, I'm a dad, so I don't know. Or I'm a mom, so I don't know. And like the parent of the same sex has been the one teaching that information, right? But I do think that there's so much resources out there, and there's a lot that can be learned. So I think as parents, if we can take that time to just learn what we can, there's a lot of free resources online. I think even like part of why we made the puberty toolkit and like we have it in there is like parents read it first, like educate yourself first and then use these resources with your kids. So I think that's one thing. I think another thing is when you're having these conversations with your kids, like include the other partner in them, right? So I think historically, like let's say moms to daughters, like it's just the mom having that conversation with the daughter. So then the daughter thinks, well, I can only go to mom, but I could bring you into that conversation and be like, hey, Dad, clearly Dad has not ever had a period before. He doesn't know this stuff, or like he has not experienced it himself, but he wants to be there for you. So if you ever have a question, you can ask him too. And even if he doesn't know right away, he'll find out the answer and he'll get back to you. Right. So I think even be honest with what you don't know or what you haven't experienced to your child. If I had a son, I would do the same thing, right? Like, I don't know. I've never had an erection before, but I do want to be here for you if you ever have a situation that feels uncomfortable. Or let's say you're talking to your son about wet dreams, right? And you're a mom and you've never experienced a wet dream before, but you do want your son to be able to come to you to say what's happened, and you can clean it up and stuff together, right? So you can be honest about what you don't know and what you haven't experienced and still be that leader that they go to. And I think it's like anything, like you're better off saying, I haven't experienced this, so I can't say what it's going to be like for you, but I can be here to support you. That's kind of like anything in life that you haven't experienced, being open about it. Something we did that I personally think will be a hit in the toolkit, and you don't need to have the toolkit to do this, but we had like these pages that you can cut out. And so kids can write questions that they feel uncomfortable asking you in person. They can write it down and put it somewhere that they know you'll see. So that if, like, let's say they want to ask you a question about sex or about something that they feel awkward about, they can write it down and like place it on your pillow or something like that. So that there's that separation so that they don't have to ask you to your face if they feel really awkward, but they do want to ask you the question.
Yeah.
Almost like a question box that you might have at school, right? And then you can come back to your child and answer it. So if you think your child might be like, they might have a lot of questions, but they're like, especially for our sensitive kids, I think they might feel even more awkward to have these conversations. So you can tell them about the question cards and let them know, hey, anytime, doesn't matter. You can write a question, place it on my pillow or my dresser or whatever, and I will get back to you and answer it. And it will be like not awkward. I won't make you feel silly about it. I think that can help as well. Does that answer your question? Or do you still feel uncomfortable? Like it might be uncomfortable for them?
No, you know what? Tonight I'm actually going to ask our oldest if she would ever come to me with those kinds of questions.
Yeah.
Because I think her default is to go to you.
Yes.
Because
I think even with friendship issues, she's definitely gravitated towards me. But yeah. I also ask her more often.
You think so?
Well, I don't know.
I ask her daily.
Do you?
About those. Well, not about like puberty related stuff, but friendship related stuff I do talk to her pretty regularly about. But again, it's a difference in experience. She knows that I've had a different experience growing up with friends. Mm-hmm. So it's like, it's not comparable.
Have you ever said the words to her like, hey, I know I haven't ever had friends, that were girls and maybe drama was happening, but if there's ever anything that comes up, I still want you to feel like you can come and talk to me. Have you ever said that to her?
Not in those words, but yeah, I've said things along those lines.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
And she will talk about that. But I just think first of all, I have not had anything even remotely close to the experience that girls have going through puberty. So that's the first thing. And like, I don't know why this was mind-blowing, but the fact that there was this special garbage can or whatever.
I feel like that shook your world because you're like, there's so much I don't know.
Yeah. I feel like that one time I realized I really don't know what I don't know. Mm-hmm. And I don't know that any amount of searching would have told me that exists. Mm-hmm. Like, I wouldn't have been able to tell them, hey, like, what happens if you die tragically and I have to take care of 3 daughters and I have to bring them through this and explain
I'll be honest,
all of these things.
I mean, that's morbid, but that's part of why I like doing the podcast and why I was really highly motivated to make this puberty toolkit because
you don't trust me to have the conversations with the kids?
Well, it's not that I don't trust you.
Is that what it is?
I'm pretty sure we added the garbage can to that toolkit, by the way.
Did you?
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
Because I want something left. It sounds morbid. But I get inspired to create content like podcasts or toolkits or courses because I want that information to be out there. And I will say, of all the things that you could research and learn about, puberty is still an area where there is room for more information out there. It's still...
There's room for improvement, for sure.
We've been doing tons of research looking at all sorts of stuff, and there's still room, definitely, for more. So hopefully we can continue to create more if that is what people are looking for, which I think they are. So
there's that. There's the fact that I don't know what I don't know.
Yep.
And there's certain things that I may just never know. Mm-hmm. Because I'm not about to walk into a women's washroom and see, what do we got going on in here? And like, what things, and like, what is this for?
What do we got going on in here?
Right.
Oh, flip open the garbage can. I mean, yeah, maybe.
But there's also, you're saying the onus is on the parents, us to educate ourselves. That also, I think, that feels a little bit overwhelming because I feel like I'm already having to learn 1,000 other things to teach our kids. Yeah. So this is just yet another one that I have to add to the list.
Yeah, add that to the mental load of being a parent.
The never-ending list of things that I have to know
Well, and you know
to
why
teach.
it's so hard for you to know these things? It's because there's still, even as adults, I mean, I think our friends tend to have more open conversations, maybe because I like to instigate the open conversations.
Yes,
but
you do.
even as adults, it's not something you're necessarily sitting around and talking with your friends, but maybe you should, right?
Actually, you were saying that we should do that, and I was thinking I'm going out for drinks and dinner with a buddy of mine tonight.
Bring it up.
I am going to bring up
Because he's
how
probably teaching his own daughter about that. They're the same age.
Yeah, I know. Or maybe he's not, and we can have a discussion about why not. You know?
Yeah, bring it up. Bring
Yeah,
it up.
I'm
and then
going
we'll talk.
to. He would love that.
He listens to this too. He would love that. But maybe I was thinking that as you were talking, I'm like, it's such a shameful thing. If you have other parents in your life, you go to a parent group, it's like, why aren't we talking about how to talk to our kids about these things? Right? There's wisdom that you can even learn from talking to other women, right? But we have so much shame of like, oh, I'm not going to tell Scott about my experience, like with having a period, right? But how would you learn without me unless you were learning from other women who have been through it? And that takes us being open and making this not such a shameful part of life that we want to hide from everyone, right? I mean, I've gone on rants about periods before. I feel like happens to a woman every single month, impacts her mood, impacts her hormones, impacts everything. No one ever talks about it. Like, that's a problem. So I don't want that for our kids. I want them to feel comfortable talking about it and comfortable talking about it with us. I want it to be able to be a dinner table conversation if it needs to be. And I think through that, you'll end up getting more comfortable. You'll have to.
Well, again, it's not. So, like I said before, it's not the fact that I feel uncomfortable with it. It's the fact that I have never learned any of these things. And now I would say the expectation is kind of that I have to know this.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. And it's overwhelming.
But I'm almost learning at the same time. Like, yeah, I do know a bit more than the kids do. But I'm almost learning at the same time because it was never something we were taught in school.
Yeah.
I was taught minimally about myself and what boys go through. So it just seems like it's a big expectation to have.
Yeah.
And I think particularly, I don't think I would have a problem if we had a boy, talking to a boy about it. But it's the fact that I'm talking to the opposite. I'm talking to 3 girls. And I have to explain something that I legitimately know very little or nothing about.
And that is where it's okay to lean on me, right? And have the conversations with them.
Yeah, but I have the privilege of having you, and in particular, having you, someone who is educated in having these discussions.
Yeah, I was just thinking about a story that I heard from a dad or a girl who didn't have a dad growing up, or didn't have a mom, sorry. So her dad was left to all the conversations, but her dad would recruit her aunt to have a lot of the conversations with her. And she really
I would probably do
appreciated
something
that,
like that.
right? So I was thinking that too, like if you don't have that person in your life, whether it's the dad or a mom or something like that who can relate to the experiences, maybe there's a trusted someone else in that child's life who can come in alongside of you. So you're still the parent who is involved. It's not like you're passing the whole conversation off, but for that relatable aspect, maybe there's an auntie or an uncle or someone who can come in and have that conversation. I respect what you're saying in terms of you wouldn't want to be the only one.
Right. And yeah, that relatability piece I think is important.
Yeah.
It's not the end all, but I do think.
I respect what you're saying because I think if I wasn't around, I would still want you to bring in, let's say, my sister-in-law to come in and talk to the girls about it. Still like telling the girls that you want to be part of it, the conversation
100%.
And learning, and you would.
Yeah, it's not that I don't want to be a part of it. It's just, first of all, I have not had it.
Yeah.
So I can't. I don't know that learning online, it will still never give me the ability to explain the experience that they're going to have.
Yeah. Yeah. I respect what you're saying. Yeah. I understand that. And I think if that's the case for you, you don't have a partner of, the same gender as your child. Maybe there is someone else that can come in and have those conversations alongside of you, so that your child can talk to someone who's been through it as well and can ask the questions to someone who's experienced it.
Okay. Well, I think that's all the questions I had for this. Hopefully you like this slightly new format that we're doing this in.
Yeah.
I'm asking you.
Oh, me? Yeah, I really enjoyed it. Yeah, I mean, you were tricky questions today, but
That's good. I spent a lot of time coming up with these questions.
I personally feel like having the questions to go off of to have the discussion makes a lot of sense. And I think we were able to get deeper into the topic. And I hope that folks appreciated it. I know it's a big topic, but I think there was lots of takeaways. So I'm excited to get the feedback for sure.
Yeah, thanks for listening in, and hope you enjoyed it. If you have questions, send an email to us or send us a DM on Instagram. We're always open to having more of this discussion because, like I said, there's so much that I don't know. So we can continue having this so that I'm better prepared. Thanks for listening.
Hey, thank you so much for being here and listening to this episode today. It means the world to us to have you here. If this conversation was helpful for you, it would mean a lot if you could like and subscribe. That just shows us if the conversation is meaningful and helpful and helps it get out to more people. Also, I just wanted to let you know that every week we have a new episode drop. And if you want to be notified when that happens, just hit the little bell icon. Again, thank you so much for being here, and we'll talk to you again next week.